So back before Runeterra launched in January, I spent about 2 months streaming and making some YouTube videos, just purely theory crafting the game, because I was really excited for it to come out, and to be honest, I didn't really have anything else to do because Underlords was kind of dead. During this time, I did a lot of card ratings and deck building based purely off of nothing but theory craft, as well as being able to play the game for a few days at a time during the two sort of like preview releases where they let people play their like pre-beta game for a couple of days. And unlike my more recent balance, patch, and expansion predictions and theory crafts, these ones were mostly universally actually really terrible. Back before like anyone really played the game long enough, we had no metagame, no history. We had basically very little understanding of the fundamentals of the game, and specifically what kinds of cards they would incentivize. And I actually spent a little bit of time just now looking back into some of my old card ratings. And I also figured, kind of like at the same time coincidentally, that I'd never be a real YouTuber until I started doing top 10 lists. So this is my top 10 inaccurate, hilariously, just massively wrong predictions from before the game launched. Number 10. Number 10 is Professor Von Yip. So obviously, this is going to be a pretty embarrassing list for me. We're going to start off with Von Yip. This is a card that I had rated as very good, and there were a couple of reasons for this. First of all, the card is, I was thinking to myself, man, there's so many just powerful one-drops in this game. It's got to hit some kind of synergy, as well as, man, +2/+2, if it dies even after only buffing like one unit, it's still getting pretty good value. And of course, if it buffs a few more, it's completely insane and game winning, right? And this is off the back of evaluating a lot of one unit cards super highly, like of course like Hapless Aristocrat, which is a lot more meta dependent than I gave it credit for. And woefully, we ended up giving Von Yip a very strong rating when this card is not even close to being remotely competitive. The biggest problem with Von Yip is that board stats just don't really matter after about turn 6 or so. If you have stats that aren't attached to some kind of keyword, or at least gearing up towards a win condition at like the kind of like where the mid game meets the late game, you just do not have a cohesive strategy because you already need to be on the closeout. This is a pretty horrible card that everyone considers a meme, and rightfully so. Number 9. Number 9 is Brothers Bond. This is a card that just looked so insanely underpriced compared to other options at the time. You know, you're thinking about the idea of like running aggro, running Noxus in aggro, of course, being like the Noxus region, and you're comparing this in your head with like so many of your options, right? You know, Elixir of Wrath, you can combine this with Overwhelm, you can do so much with this. And for 2 mana, the idea of getting the permanent buff. This is not a temporary buff like Elixir of Wrath. It's a permanent buff for 2 different allies. It can be a combat trick that swings 2 different combats, and you deal so much damage to your opponent's face. It can translate into so much damage that this card looked absolutely insane to me. Now, Brothers Bond, as we know, is a card that has only seen pretty fringe competitive play in the entire history of Runeterra so far. The biggest problem with this card is attack is a stat that has a hard time doing much unless it's attached to a keyword that allows you to be able to go for the Nexus face, right? Otherwise, it will often just get blocked out. There's just so many ways to kind of like invalidate this card, and in aggro, it's a really important element of your deck that you want to eventually concede the possession of the board and just try to finish your opponent off with proper over the top instead of trying to buff your units. In addition to that, the fact that this is a permanent buff almost never matters because your units kind of only live for 1 turn anyway, and it's very counterable. Number 8. Oblivious Islander. Oblivious Islander is a card that I looked at and I thought was sort of categorically insane. The idea of a card that's sort of like ramp you into your top end win condition. There's so many things you just want to be able to discount to play an entire turn earlier, and just being attached to like a decent 1-drop body, I felt made this card have to be hitting some like multiple competitive decks, as well as almost like single-handedly enable a lot of degenerate strategies. This is back in the day where like curving this into a Nivea was, seen in testing to be a very good strat, but I thought Islander had a lot of ability to be really powerful even outside of that like sort of degenerate Nivea combo. A really big thing with Islander is just there's so many cards in like late game card games that are sort of like win game buttons, so when you can cheat them out early without having to pay too much for it, a card like Oblivious Islander could be insane. The biggest problem with Islander though is the fact that it gives the card Ephemeral is just too big of a downside with how most expensive units do want the ability to close out the game. Number 7. Number 7 is Atrocity. Atrocity is a card that I looked at and I said, oh my god, this card costs 6 mana just to fling it into the Nexus. How could this possibly be worth it on its own? And the answer is, well, there's a lot of different answers to how this card ended up being good, but it turns out that just the way the card pool in Runeterra works, any way to engage into a finisher that doesn't rely on unit-to-unit combat ends up being incredibly powerful, and in the late game you usually have a reserve of spell mana that you're not really tapping into anyway, right? It also ends up being a pretty good counter to any sort of like unit-specific removal like Will or Vengeance, and so ended up making a lot of sense in a lot of different decks from different times. Historically it was run a little bit with some of like the Ladros decks, but kind of more competitively has seen more usage in stuff like deep decks or stuff like They Who Endure decks. Number 6, Single Combat. Now, Single Combat is a card that has, obviously throughout the patches, basically defined what it means to be mid-range Demacia. Even most aggro Demacia variants are running 1 or 2 copies of Single Combat. Single Combat is the Demacia staple, kind of like removal all-rounder tool, and when it was Theorycraft time, I did not think much of this card at all. A really big thing with this card is just its like immense flexibility, like truly immense. You can use it to counter any opponent's spell that is targeting their unit and relying on that unit surviving for the spell to resolve. Cards like Glimpse Beyond or Atrocity, for example. It also has the ability to deny your own unit. You can kill off your own unit intentionally if you don't want an opponent's effect to resolve on that unit. For example, if your opponent is about to lifesteal off of your unit or kill it in any sort of way that generates additional value, you can use Single Combat to trade off your own unit so that they can't get their special effect. You can also use it on your own lifesteal, like Radiant Guardian, and you can heal off of that in a really impactful way. But the biggest thing you can do with Single Combat is just deny an opponent's value engine. There's such incredibly limited removal and disruption tools in the game that just having a way to deny an opponent value engine, a way to just interact with their board, outside of being just a specific combat trick like Whirling Death is absolutely imperative. You can also use it to level up Garen. So Single Combat is just like an insanely powerful tool that I massively underrated. Number 5. So it's actually a really interesting thing that's going on here. This is where we get into the really embarrassing stuff. The next 5 in this list are things that I look back and I just don't see how I possibly could have thought the things I used to think about these cards. Now, this is not actually about Greenglade Duo in particular, but number 5 is the elusive keyword. I did not see the immense value that the elusive keyword contained. In my head, I was comparing it to flying in Magic, and it is so much stronger than flying is. The reason for this has nothing to do with the reach keyword, and everything to do with the fact that in Runeterra, every unit has haste and vigilance, which is to say that not only can they attack the turn they get played, but they can also block even after attacking. And therein lies the real value in the elusive keyword. Because the ability to block is placed at a higher premium, any card that gets through that ability to block is much more valuable. Because I can be attacking my opponent and then I can still block on my next turn, whereas they can't block me at all. So it is just fundamentally so much stronger than flying in Magic could ever be. And I actually ended up underrating the entirety of Ionia as a region because of this. Because I underrated Elusive, I made the claim way back when that Ionia was just a really weak region, and Deny and Will were not strong enough cards to even carry them. In fact, this was before I figured out Will was a really, really good card. I was saying Deny is an alright card, the rest of Ionia just completely sucks. And I think that actually would have been true if the Elusive keyword wasn't so ridiculous. Green Glade Duo just turned out to be, well, there's also stuff like, you know, some of the Karma decks that have historically hit like once or twice in the past. But that's about it for Ionia. Most of the time, they are just riding off the back of Elusives so hard. That is just what they do as a region. And misevaluating this caused me to like misrank the entire region because of it. Number 4. Fast spells in general. This is, well, there's a pretty long list of them, but basically every spell in the game seems incredibly overcosted until you factor in that the ability to tap into your spell mana as well as to play them at fast speed is insanely powerful given Runeterra's priority system. So these are cards like Grasp, Withering Wail. I already did mention Atrocity, but I hated the card so much. I was so convinced it had to have been bad that I'm giving it its own category on this list. Will of Ionia, back to back, which I eventually came around on, but in the beginning I thought it was absolute garbage. And the list basically, it just goes on, but I will mention Vengeance. It took me like a month and a half at least to admit that Vengeance was actually a competitive card. Now this is, you know, obviously very widespread. There's so many cards that this impacts, but I ended up putting it, you know, a little bit lower on the list just because this is an extremely common reaction to any player coming from like other card games like Hearthstone or Magic. This is probably the one that I'm most not alone in, because when you look at the mana cost of these cards, like in Magic, this effect would cost like 2 or 3 mana, the ability to kill a unit. The Will of Ionia would cost 1 mana, right? Grasp in Magic costs 3 mana. It is absolutely insane. These cards seem so ridiculously bad, but it's all about the open attack system. Now, it doesn't have as much to do with spell mana. I know a lot of people think that it's kind of like, well, spell mana, you can like bank mana, and that's a part of it, but the much bigger thing is the ability to be played at fast speed. Because in Runeterra, you're both going on the same turn, and to stop the opponent from developing blockers, your objective as the offensive player, if you're afraid of blockers, is to open attack, well, suddenly the only counter to that is fast speed spells. It's really important to note that this is the reason why, because if it was just spell mana, we'd see a lot of slower spells actually being viable, when in reality, most slow spells are kind of doomed to be bad. There's a couple exceptions, but the ability to counter open attacks by just responding with a tempo surge that affects the board and affects the combat at fast speed, or even, you know, doing your own open attack, you know, with something like back to back, which used to cost 5 mana, is kind of bad these days, but on launch it was crazy. It's just so insanely powerful and so worth paying like double price for, like paying an insane amount of mana compared to what you'd expect. Number 3, Dawn Speakers. Dawn Speakers. Now, a lot of you guys will remember my first ever deck in Runeterra, the one I published, and it was all over ladder for the first couple of days of the game's launch. It didn't last very long, and it was the Dawn Spiders deck that I built with Precipic and Nib way back in the day. God, I still have memories of this. Dawn Speakers was a card I felt was just an absolutely insane card. Of course, it is very true that it is like a snowball card that relies the board and is disruptible, but I was so convinced that Dawn Speakers was a card that was just basically absolutely insane. Absolutely insane, because all it takes is like 1 proc, and this card has already given you a crazy amount of value just off of 1 proc. All it takes, 1 single effect, and this card has paid for itself. And of course, if it procs a few more times, then it's going to be insane. Then it's going to be absolutely insane. I was so convinced that this card would be nuts that that I took a bet with someone from my Twitch chat bet me $200 that Dawn Speakers wouldn't end up competitive, and I lost that bet. I lost $200 because Dawn Speakers ended up just being super, super, super overrated. In reality, a big problem with this card is the same problem with Von Yip. Even if it gives insane stats, the stats in Runeterra are just not worth very much after like turn 6 or so of the game, right? So you get a huge wall of stats, but your opponent is just going to end the game by killing you with something like Elusive or some kind of spell, something like Ezreal or Ruination. So like there's just no deck in the game that can't handle a big wall of stats in the late mid game. Dawn Speakers just ended up fading into obscurity entirely because of that. Now, you must be asking yourself, Swim, you lost $200 on this, but this is still only number 3 on the list. What cards could possibly be even more embarrassing to be wrong about than Dawn Speakers? And oh boy, we are getting there. Number 2, Shark Chariot. Shark Chariot and Soul Shepherd both. I spent a lot of time during the preview patches playing kind of like an ephemeral tempo sort of aggro skewing deck and thought it was just insane. Of course, I was steamrolling a lot of games. You can just resummon this for infinite value. You can just race your opponent down so easily, and you just get such free stats too. The stat lines on these cards for the mana cost just seemed so good and too good to be true even. And the reality is, yeah, they were too good to be true. My folly with Shark Chariot and the idea of ephemeral aggro as a whole ended up being the same problem as when we rated elusives. Just because you can both block and attack in this game, the ability to block is too valuable. So in Magic, the idea of a card like this that just generates so much value, you can race your opponent down, might actually be good, but in Runeterra, your opponent will race you down every time because they have the ability to block, and Shark Chariot only exists for half of the turns. As a card that, gets value, can get blocked at the late game, but cannot ever block itself. It is just a card that is an absolute meme. A lot of people are actually still clinging to the hope that Shark Chariot is a better card than it seems and is sort of just waiting for the right synergy to make work. And I gotta tell you, this is a card that is fundamentally too weak. This is a card that is not just waiting for the right support. The ability for the opponent to block this in the late game, but you not being able to, block yourself, just makes Shark Chariot way too weak in a competitive environment. You will get raced down on average. Number 1, Ezreal. Ezreal is a card that has dominated many patches of Runeterra's history. It started with Ezreal Freljord, and then Ezreal Nox. Ezreal Karma was the best deck for multiple patches, and now we've got a lot of people playing Ezreal TF as kind of the go-to combo deck. I'm gonna be honest with you, for what's happening right now, I'm actually pretty sure for the next month before the Targon expansion, we're going to see a lot more Ezreal decks. This like Ezreal TF and Ezreal Karma are going to get more and more common. It's well positioned to take over the current metagame right now. But man, Ezreal was a card that I was very convinced was just too slow and too clunky. There's a couple of reasons I was wrong about that. I mean, he encompasses kind of like everything I'm really talking about. Every single misevaluation in this entire list, every fundamentally wrong notion in my head, Ezreal is just at the center point of literally all of them. He's elusive, which I undervalued. He has the ability to end the game without engaging in combat, or like, you know, developing into board stats, which I was overvaluing late game board stats in forms of, you know, you see Dawn Speakers being valued. I was undervaluing spell-based finishers with stuff like Atrocity being undervalued. And of course, I was like, you know, overvaluing the idea of developing into the early turns when Ezreal is best when you're just banking mana for him with the ability to play him early. Lastly, I really, when comparing different champions together, I insanely undervalued the fact that he counted the triggers in your hand and deck instead of relying on being on board to have his level up condition met, which of course in hindsight is really dumb. And of course, like, having to level on the board is so much worse than being able to level in your hand and deck. And of course, I was undervaluing a lot of the ability to successfully, you know, target so many enemies and keep the game going on for so long. It is just, Ezreal is one of the strongest cards in the entire game. He single-handedly defines a majority of the metas that we've seen have been entirely defined by Ezreal, and a lot of the decks that you have to run to counter him and like cards that you have to run to play around him, it's just, the game is so different because of Ezreal. And you know, I'm actually really glad because I love Ezreal. Ezreal decks have been, I haven't played as much of them recently, but I was like a really big forerunner of like the Ezreal Freljord and the Ezreal Nox during their heyday. And of course, we did really well in the Twitch Rivals playing Ezreal Karma, which I didn't play a ton on ladder, but you know, I still love the playstyle of like Ezreal combo. I love this champion in general. I'm super happy that he exists in the competitive realm, much to many players' chagrin. All right, guys, that is it. That is my top 10 things that I was just massively, absurdly, insanely wrong about my evaluations before the game launched. It's actually like really cathartic, just kind of like going back. It's like the time capsule, right? Going back and looking at the predictions and the things, you know, because I was right about some things, but man, my like idea of what the fundamental like competitive landscape of the game would look like before we had metas, before I had played the game for more than a couple hours, we're just so off. It is just like, it's great looking back at how wrong I was back then, way back before I knew anything about the game and before kind of anybody knew anything about the game. It was a really kind of fun and memorable time of just like pure theorycraft, and theorycraft is what I really enjoy about in card games. All right, guys, that's it for this video. In the spirit of being a true YouTuber, let me know in the comments down below if this top 10 list is if you agreed with any of the items on our top 10 list. Yeah, that's it. And smash that like button.